Welcome back to Easily Explained, where today we will be talking about two different types of population growth. So let's get started. In the last video, we've been covering population growth, but we started to talk about factors of population growth, such as birth rate, death rate, and immigration and emigration. But today we are going to be talking about two different types of population growth: exponential growth and logistical growth. So we're going to be going into both exponential and logistical growth in more depth. So let's start with exponential growth. In exponential growth, the population is growing exponentially, like it has in the name. It occurs when the individuals in the population are reproducing at a constant rate that is growing exponentially. But exponential growth is actually really unrealistic, especially when we talk about a long-term population. Some changes that are happening long-term, you can't sustain exponential growth because it happens under ideal circumstances. Unlimited resources, no predation, no diseases. And since we're growing exponentially, this population is growing exponentially, it's very unlikely, because at some point when the population keeps increasing, it's going to start having limited resources. It's going to be easier for disease to spread, and competition is going to start, because once the population has reached a certain limit, there won't be enough resources to support everyone. So that's why we can't think of exponential growth as something that happens for a very long period of time. Or rather, it's something that happens under ideal circumstances. And we'll talk about those very limited circumstances. One of these ideal circumstances that exponential growth can occur in is when a population moves to a new area. It immigrates to a new area. Why? Because once you immigrate to a new area, there's going to be different resources and different animals that are present. Moving to a new area means that the species might not be exposed to any actual predators. They don't have any natural predators, so they won't have anything that will keep their population in check. Also, if that area is not inhabited by a lot of other species, in the beginning it'll seem like they have unlimited resources, since there are plenty to use. But as the population keeps growing, that's when we start to see less resources, because those resources are gradually being used up by the ever-growing population. And that leads to all of those competition and limiting resources, less resources to use, more animals that want to use them. So that's when our growth starts to, it doesn't necessarily have to slow, it can level off, become a little bit more constant, or it could just completely decrease. It can also occur after a catastrophic event. So when we talked about primary versus secondary succession was what happened after some sort of natural disaster or human-caused disaster, and how the species rebounded, rebuilt that environment so that it could support them. Exponential growth can happen after this catastrophic event because either the species emigrated out of the area, or they found a new environment, or the secondary succession occurred. And in the same situation, it's the same as the previous one. They might not have any natural predators left, or there may not have been any in this new area. And the resources may seem unlimited at first because they're not used up. But as the population continues to grow, then those resources become more and more limited, and that's when we see exponential growth starts to stop happening. Now that we have a good understanding about exponential growth, let's talk about its graph. Exponential growth results in what we call a J graph, mostly because if we were to look at this graph right here, it kind of looks like a J. It starts off a little bit more constant and then it starts to curve up until it becomes pretty straight. Now let's analyze this graph a little bit more. So the beginning part where it's starting, it's a little bit constant at the beginning. That's when the population is still getting settled or whatever. They're just moving into this new environment or recovering after this catastrophic event. And then from this period on to about this period is when you're experiencing your exponential growth. It's the population is growing exponentially. There's ideal circumstances, no limits to your growth. And then when we start to get the more straighter line, that's when you see it's starting to level off. It's starting to reach a limit where it can't support anything more. And that limit is actually very specific. When we talk about ecology, we call it, that number, the carrying capacity. So let's go over that. Carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals that an environment can support given its resources or access to resources or whatever. So you can think of this as like the maximum number of individuals that can be in a population. Kind of like if you've ever entered a public building, you might have seen a sign on the wall that says maximum capacity 400 people or whatever. It's kind of like that. It's the largest number of individuals that can not necessarily survive, but have enough resources for everybody, have enough space for everybody. And when that carrying capacity is reached, it becomes harder and harder for the population to grow anymore because that environment simply cannot support all of those people or all of those organisms. It doesn't have enough resources for that. That's when you start to see competition for those resources. And that does not lead to population growth. It leads to the population declining because less organisms are getting the resources they need to survive. And so that is when your growth rate is leveling off. It's becoming zero. It's becoming no growth rate, and it might even lead to a decreasing growth rate, a negative growth rate. Now we can move on to logistical growth. Logistical growth is the type of growth that occurs after exponential growth because exponential growth cannot continue in a population for very long in nature. Because the growth of that population is slowing, or maybe it's stopping as the resources become less available and the carrying capacity is starting to get closer and closer. So that's where logistical growth comes in. It occurs when the population's growth is slowing or stopping following a period of exponential growth. So logistical growth happens after exponential growth. The graph that we just drew about the J curve is we're going to add on to that for the growth, for the graph of the logistical growth, since it happens after exponential growth. So it does level off at the carrying capacity like we talked about, because once that number is reached, the environment cannot support any more individuals and it doesn't have enough resources for them all to survive, or it can lead to competition and many other things that will stop the population growth or slow the population growth. Now let's talk about the graph of logistical growth. So we call the graph of the logistical growth like an S curve because it's your S-shaped curve. And if you'll notice, since it is happening after exponential growth, you can see the remnants of the J graph. It starts to increase slowly by slowly, and then it becomes exponential, But slowly, now we're entering the period of logistical growth. It starts to become constant. It's leveling off, and it'll continue to do this. So at this point right here, this is where you're reaching your carrying capacity. Because now the growth rate is starting to become 0. And even if it's not perfectly straight, it could zigzag a little bit, but it's mostly constant. Any variation will be very small because it cannot support any more than that. It can't keep going up forever. It has to find a way to level off because we don't have infinite resources. So that's why we can draw this S-shaped graph as kind of almost line of best fit, you can think of it as, because it's pretty constant, and so we think of it as constant. Congratulations! You're now an expert at the types of population growth. If this video helped, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye!